Welcome to Double Trouble, Macdonald-Laurier Institute's new podcast series, where we explore the implications of the emerging axis of authoritarianism between Russia and China for Canada, for our allies, friends, and the world. Double Trouble is generously supported by Konrad-Adenauer Foundation's Canada office. I'm your host, Balkan Devlen, Director of the Transatlantic Program at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and I am delighted to be joined by two of our senior fellows today, Alexander Lanoszka and Richard Shimooka, to talk about the NATO Summit last week, and particularly focus on what that means and for Canada and Canadian contribution to the alliance as we face this double trouble, Russia and China, and their threat to the international peace and stability and Canadian security and prosperity. There were a number of announcements that were made last week. Just the government staying on brand, continued to make announcements in lieu of policy and implementation. We had a number of them. Some we already heard multiple times before, so they were reheated announcements, be it the announcement about the submarines or the date about when Canada is going to reach 2% of GDP when it comes to defense spending, a date that just seems to me at least, plucked out of thin air because there was no details provided at all. And the Prime Minister highlighted that, we'll tell you how we're going to get there in 2028. On the one hand, those are the old announcements, but then there were also two new trilateral groupings have been announced, or at least intentions to work together with different allies. One is the so-called Ice Pact, about building icebreakers for the Arctic between U.S., Canada, and Finland, and the other one, a maritime defense alliance, or at least an intention to work together with Germany and Norway about the North Atlantic. So, but again, the details seems to be a bit scarce. So I want to get into details of this, and particularly when it comes to the defense spending announcements and these trilaterals, what that means for Canadian security, Canadian contributions to NATO. How were these announcements were received received by our allies in NATO, and can we expect a follow-on through a rigorous implementation of any of these, or would the government stick with with its tradition of announcement as policy? So let me turn to Richard first to have your take first, maybe perhaps about the new announcements about the icebreakers and the North Atlantic component, and then we can talk about these reheated announcements about submarines, as well as the magical number 2032. Over to you, Richard.
Yeah, thanks, Balkan. So I think we'll have to see a bit how these trilateral groupings kind of play out, right? I think the ice pack, or the agreement on icebreakers, is an interesting one. It reflects, I think, some of the industrial dynamics that are occurring within the alliance, specifically the United States. There's simply no shipbuilding capacity among the major manufacturers. You've actually seen some efforts to engage foreign sort of manufacturers and foreign countries to actually undertake not just shipbuilding but also the maintenance work. The Japanese and the Koreans are quite focused in this area. So you see this kind of follows along this trend, and the U.S. Coast Guard's ice-breaking fleet is quite elderly as well, just like ours. They need replacement desperately. Some of their major ships are reaching 40-some years old, and again, this is well past their sort of their rust out date, as it's called. So, but we don't know what this will actually mean in terms of actual production and how this is going to go forward. Canada has the national shipbuilding strategy, of which it used to be two shipyards. Now it's a third one with Davie. Davie seems to be the one that might be best positioned to sort of take advantage of this. They've put up a fair number of press releases since, but again, we just don't know, right? So I think that for that one, we'll see. Again, with the German sort of pack, we'll see again. Like that one's even more, it has even less detail, and um, there's not really a real clear understanding of what it may turn out with. And a lot of people started tying this with our potential submarine purchase, which we can get to later. There's a couple reasons that that may not be the case, and that's really a lot to do with the programmatic details of that program in specifically.
No, that's great. I mean, particularly when it comes to the German, Norwegian, Canadian announcement, it looked like it read to me a lot, a lot more like a memorandum of understanding. It's sort of a statement of intent, um, uh, and not more than that. But I think it will be an interesting one to observe how again the implementation goes. Alexander, let me turn to you on the same two things. The both of them, have the focus on the North Atlantic and the Arctic. DPU was the same story, our North strong and free. So there's a very clear sort of line going through as Canada's contribution to NATO would be the northern flank and the western flank of NATO kind of approach. So what do you make of those those two announcements before we get into the other stuff?
I think we have to step back a little bit and put the Washington summit into its proper context, especially as regards to how Canada fits into the picture. The basic understanding amongst many members of the alliance is that Canada has not been doing its fair or full share, even though, of course, it is deployed in Latvia as a framework nation. And to the credit of the Trudeau government, has increased its defense budget since coming to power in 2015. Around when Harper was still prime minister, it was hovering around 1%. Now it's about 1.3, 1.4%, depending on how you count it. That seems significant, but then you have to also consider that many other governments within NATO were faced with very similar budgetary circumstances after the financial crisis. And one can very well laud the Trudeau government for increasing defense spending, but again, taken into a much larger perspective, it still remains very much a laggard. And so those announcements that were coming out of the Washington summit seem to diffuse some of the criticism directed at Canada. Some of it was fairly explicit. We heard from American lawmakers that soft power may be important, but has to be indeed coupled with at least hard power, that Canada needs to step up and spend a lot more. And so my general interpretation of those announcements serve to deflect that criticism, to demonstrate that Canada actually has some sort of interest in fulfilling its defense commitments. There may be a lot of doubt as to the validity of the 2% spending commitment as such. Nevertheless, whatever hangups Canadian lawmakers might have, they have at least pegged themselves to a particular date with regards to 2032. Of course, the details remain scarce, is what Richard had mentioned. 2032 is a long time in politics. It's not a long time in the defense world, however. It is 2 parliaments away from us. And we know that capitalization projects do take a long, long time. And because the details are scarce and does feel like it is simply a rehashing of those paragraphs in the defense policy update, that the plan is not simply credible.
No, I think that's a very important point. And just let me do the commercials here very quickly. Last week, we sat down with Alexander and Tom Strostox to talk about Canada's mission in Latvia, which is right now they used to be called the Enhanced Forward Presence. Right now, it's a multinational group in Latvia, and we go ahead and watch that Inside Policy Talks from last week, which was based on a report that Alexander and Tom's wrote for MLI in April. Also on Friday, I sat down and talked with Brownlee Crowley, MLI's managing director, as well as Jamie Trones, Synapse Center for North American Prosperity and Security, executive director, Jamie Trones, on their impressions of NATO and how Canada and Canadian announcements have been received by the allies on the ground. So do go ahead and have a look at it. And I would add that talking with some of the European diplomats since the summit and the announcements, my impression was that everyone is taking all those with a with a truckload of salt, and not just a grain, and it would like to see the implementation, the money, and the plan going forward, given the fact that the previous announcements would not necessarily follow through. So I don't think the Trudeau government will be able to fool anyone going forward.
I would just say
Yes.
that I think that it's the kind of news cycle where you have a big announcement, and it seemed like a big announcement, even though a lot of this stuff was re-announcements, right? And then, if you don't understand the sort of the milieu and the depth of how the Canadian Defense, administration or programming works, it seems like they've sort of done something new. I would submit that, and this we've seen this in previous summits. I think that this won't last for very long. And once these individuals get briefed about, well, yeah, this is kind of a re-announcement, and you can't really trust what they've said on this or that, right? I think that will sort of percolate through, and a lot of the sort of the diffusing element, it just may be just a pause, right? And it just may continue, because I think that if you look at the sentiment that was expressed pretty widely, especially within the U.S. Congress, it's not likely to go away anytime soon. If you talk to their staff members, especially not just the congressional, but below that, it's well understood at a very granular level that Canada's actual military capabilities is very limited, and this is not going to make much of a dent into what their serious problems are with Canada.
Well, let's stay with that, then, Richard. I mean, you're observing this very closely, and have good connections and understand how Americans see these announcements, and more broadly, Canadian defense spending and procurement and policy in general. Um, I have two questions on this one. One is, give the audience a bit of a more clear an understanding of how Americans see this. It is, as our most important ally. It's very important to see how they view these policies, because my sense is that a lot of Canadians may or may not be necessarily aware of the discontent, which is a bipartisan discontent across the board within the United States about how Canada carries out its defense policy. And the second one is, do you see any sense of that discontent getting through to Ottawa and popping that bubble that the government seems to be like, we can muddle through and we'll make announcements, everybody buy it, and we'll move on. Yeah.
Yeah. So yes. Sorry, second part. Your second question first. Yes, and I think they have understood it. And so the U.S. is in a bit different case than our NATO allies because of the binational command and NORAD/NORTHCOM. The U.S. clearly takes its northern security extremely seriously. You can think about ground-based missile defense, which is based in Alaska and along the west and east coast. You can understand that there's a serious effort being put forward to ensure that homeland security in the sort of in the harder defense side is up front and center. Because Canada basically has around 60%, let's say, of the northern approaches under its territory, and needs to sort of be a strong partner. Canada has a unique role that no other state has. Not Australia, not the United Kingdom. Canada basically sits at the core of U.S. defense policy for the continent. So, what does this mean? That because of some of the dynamics of how U.S. government works, Congress actually has a really important role to, with appropriations and defense policy setting, to sort of understand what Canada brings to fore. And if you look at a lot of the sort of discussions, you think about Dan Sullivan, the senator from Alaska, and how much he was very vocal about the state of Canada's lack of defense spending. They understand this far more granularly than any other state would. What's happened is that, going to your second question, is that if you look at the defense policy update and you understand where the money has sort of been allocated, NORAD renewal was put first. You look at the over-the-horizon radar projects, the two of them. You look at the networking aspect, CBC2 as it's called. These are programs that are getting money early, right? You think about the F-35, the upgrade of our sort of primary fighter fleet. It's happening in the next 5-10 years, right? Or next 5 years, let's say, right? As we transition through this program. So Northern security has gotten the priority clearly in terms of defense funding, ignoring somewhat some of the stuff that's going in with the Latvia mission, which expansion of the mission there. So with that being said, the Canadian government sees this as a big issue, and what Congress is kind of, or what the U.S. government is kind of has approached is left Canada a bit alone and given us a bit of room, let's say, to sort of develop our approach and build out sort of a lot of the capabilities that's essential for our bilateral sort of defense in the north. It's a bit of slack, more so than they would give in other areas, but they really want to see this to happen. And part of the problem is that these are some really immense technical challenges. These over-the-horizon radar projects are their scale and their sort of the power that they're going to put forward, and their sort of the ability to understand the northern domain are quite expansive, and there's a lot of technical risk involved with these projects. So it's probably the year that we've been given sort of the leash, say, if you want to do this, go ahead, right? But the risk, if we fail or if we have some serious delays, is going to be very evident to the Americans in a way that, let's say, any other project that if we were delayed, 2, 3, 4, 5 years and X amount of cost over, it's going to blow back on us in a way that probably no other project would.
No, I think this is important. I want to get back to this in a minute, but particularly the fact that this is not there's not much leeway to screw it up, is what I understand. And I'm not sure whether that is, I mean, I'm sure that is understood within the ND, within GAV, within people who are actually sort of have to deal with this. But I'm not sure this is particularly well understood within the broader public or within the political class, as if, yeah, we'll weather this fine. We did it before. So I want to get back to that, whether that's, that is the case. And if not, what are the implications for Canada for failing to actually fulfill those promises and requirements for our relationship with the United States, but also for, of course, for the defense of Canada and our sovereignty. Alexander, let me turn to you on the allies' perceptions as well, and in a similar way, so how Americans are seeing this and paying attention to. You have very good connections with the other side of the pond, and what's your sense of the European allies' take on constant announcements but not much delivery when it comes to Canadian defense spending and contribution?
I think the bottom line is that they don't really think about Canada much at all. And so Canada does not register as much as perhaps it used to during the Cold War or even before the Cold War. And I think that speaks to how we have chronically underinvested ourselves, that we've sort of put ourselves out of that conversation. And I think you've had your own experience to this effect at various international fora and conferences. Latvians do pay attention because, of course, we provide the backbone to the enhanced forward presence, or however you want to call it these days, in that particular country. They are much more mindful of the constraints that we ourselves have, in part because we are there to provide deterrence as well as reassurance against a very powerful neighbor, albeit one that is, of course, overcommitted in Ukraine. And as much as the Latvians are appreciative of what we are doing, and indeed Canada has a very good reputation in that country, there is still some sense that Canada is not going to be entirely sufficient on its own right to provide the security that Latvia needs from its Western counterparts within the alliance. And so we have seen on occasion calls on the part of the Latvian government for a greater American presence on their country. Now, Latvia is not unique in this way, but nevertheless, it does suggest some diffidence in what Canada can provide. The Latvian government, in addition to Estonia and Lithuania, have announced earlier this year an intention to build a fortification system called the Baltic Defense Line. Again, I think that speaks to not just some of the lessons gathered from the Ukrainian experience, where fortifications actually matter a great deal, but also the sense that Canada might not necessarily be able to reinforce its military presence there, that would have to rely on the lift capabilities of others, and that those lift capabilities are not going to be a given. Of course, Estonia and Lithuania are also involved in the same project. So they do have the same concerns, and they do have different framework nations, United Kingdom and Estonia, and Germany and Lithuania. Poland has devised plans for its own fortifications along the eastern frontier, Tarczów Sud, or Eastern Shield. And indeed, Poland receives military support directly from the United States. So I don't want to necessarily overstate Latvian anxieties, but one can argue, and certainly many have, including colleagues of ours, that Latvian concerns about Canada, as much as they're appreciative of those contributions, has meant that they have had to increase their defense budget far more than they would like. And this is not a rich country like Canada, mind you, so it's a very difficult constraint for them to achieve. That they have to undertake what could be unpopular measures like conscription. It's voluntary, as paradoxical as it sounds at the moment, but nevertheless, that goes to show that they're not entirely confident of what Canada could provide. Again, I don't want to overstate the Canadian factor. Any ally facing a massive threat like Russia would have very good rational reasons to lack complete confidence in the security guarantees that it receives. But nevertheless, as far as Latvia is concerned, there is some concern indeed as to the quality of the guarantee that Canada can provide.
I mean, it's also, it's as you pointed out, well, everyone wants American troops, fundamentally, in the sense that, you know, U.S. is the defender of last resort. If you look at it, the nuclear deterrent, yes, nuclear sharing and other nuclear states within Europe, etc., but it's primarily the U.S. nuclear deterrent, extended deterrence, that actually provides that particular ultimate guarantee. And countries, rightly or wrongly, feel that having U.S. troops on the ground provides a firmer support and guarantee for the extension and actual sort of use of that nuclear deterrent if the need is there. Yes, Alexander, and then Richard.
I do want to react to something that Richard had said earlier in his excellent answer. There is definitely concern over Canada's ability to provide hardware. I think the issue also with respect to persistently low defense funding relates to another concern that Americans or American lawmakers might have about Canada, is that by persistently underspending on defense for such a long time as Canada has, Canada is just not going to have the psychological, mental, or even emotional wherewithal to think hard about defense issues. That there is a software problem that comes up as well. So yes, Canada may very well be making those investments in NORAD or in other issues relating to the Arctic. But if Canada is seen as a weak link in the alliance precisely because it has constitutionally underprepared itself strategically, then that's going to be, of course, a very serious concern for Canada. So there's definitely the hardware aspect to which Richard alluded very eloquently. But I think there's also this psychological, emotional, even mental aspect that we can't necessarily ignore either.
No, absolutely. And again, I mean, when it comes to deterrence, it's a psychological phenomenon. Yes, there is the mechanisms and the capability, which makes it credible, et cetera, but it is fundamentally about having a particular mindset and having the other side, your enemy, having or directing them towards a particular mindset. So it is important to have that going into it, and not only having the capabilities. Like, for example, no one would doubt just one example, the Finnish commitments, for example, when it comes to, apart from putting everything related to the capabilities and the hardware, that the way the strategic thinking within Finland would leave no doubt in everybody's mind within NATO that if it comes to it, they will fight, right? So it's a very important notion. Richard, I think you had a point, and I'll get back to the submarines and the defense spending in a minute afterwards.
Well, let me respond to Alexander's comment. Well, his response to mine to start with. I actually have 2 points. So first part is, I think what's interesting to see, I believe Justin Trudeau is the longest serving head of state at this at the NATO meeting. There might be somebody that out there, but or Godin maybe.
Orban would be.
Yeah, it would be the only other one, right? Yeah. Which is not going to validate my point at all. It's just that I don't think he has many ideological allies left in NATO. NATO has really, in the past 10 years, has really changed its sort of focus in light of the 2014 invasion, or start of the invasion, and the 2022 invasion. So you've seen a real sea shift in thinking. And I think if you read the tea leaves a bit of how, let's say, the climate change announcement went down, and some of the language that Trudeau had during the meetings, as well as I think a lot of his advisors talk about defense and security, and you think about sort of Freeland and other. Melanie Joly is the one I was thinking of. Talking about the rules, I think there is a real concern to strengthen your point, Alexander, within, especially within Congress, because again, Congress has a very large sort of staff body that sort of, they look at these issues and they understand very well what we're thinking and what's going on, and they were very clear for a number of years that you need to take this much more seriously, and this kind of approach to security just isn't, or this view of the international order just is not. This is not acceptable, or this is not a reality that you're facing, right? So I think that concern definitely has been, that lack of trust is now coming to the fore, and you've watched the diplomatic niceties kind of fall away slowly when you have Mike Johnson and Mitch McConnell, right? The House Majority Leader and the Senate Minority Leader basically just say it out loud. I think that's a really, really striking place to be in. That's not something they would say, right? To your second point on the capabilities and the equipment, and especially what we bring to the fore, I think there's a real clear now understanding that we're very limited, right? That we are doing every piece of effort in order just to sustain 2,000 plus troops. There's huge capability gaps. The lack of ground-based air defense in a consistent, effective manner that our allies bring to fore is a really striking sort of lack of capability. The fact that we can really only deploy one squadron of tanks, and there's no real attritional reserve. So if we ever gone in a shooting war, it gets really ugly really, really quickly, right? Our artillery is not mobile, right? I can keep going on. All the lessons that we see what's going on in Ukraine, it's like we've not learned them. We haven't even learned the ones of 2014 in some ways, just in the terms of the capital acquisitions of equipment, or it's coming, but it's taking too long, right? So on some of those kind of granular aspects, I do see that they don't trust, or they want more, because this is all Canada's got. We can't even say, we don't even have the fighters to send over, right? We suspended our NATO rotations, right? So it's very patently evident that we are not. This is it. We just don't have that capability, and the only place that we've, as saying before, we really put all our eggs in to ensure that we have the capability is really on the NORAD side, because I think there's maybe I 100% this is a political calculation or political realization, but maybe the only ally that really matters to this government is the United States, and keeping them happy for obvious bilateral trade, political, whatever reasons.
No, and I think that's a very important point. One of the business leaders, I forgot who basically tweeted and mentioned it, that whenever now they went down to United States and they want to talk about trade and economy and everyone across the board, we got wait. What are you doing on defense? What are you doing on Arctic? What are you doing this? Before we start talking about the trade and economy and so on and so forth. And this is even true for business leaders, right? This is not only the congressional staff or the politicians or Pentagon and whatnot, right? So I think that mindset shift and that is being brought back home. I think would is one of the reasons why I think there's this panicked announcements, and I would really call it a panicked announcement, because my sense, and again, this is pure speculation looking outside, is that the Trudeau government went and thought that we're going to announce these new trilaterals and we'll say we'll do it stuff, and then we can basically muddle through like we did in Vilnius without having to say anything very clear, and then being hammered across the board by the allies privately and publicly. Sent them to spinning in the sense that, okay, we got to come up with a date. What's the date? And they, I don't know how they come up with it. And that's what I want to talk about. And then we will talk about the submarines as the last issue. 2032, how realistic it is, what needs to be done to get to Canada to 2% or beyond, which is actually what is being needed right now. and what do we need to spend money on? Richard, let me start with you, and then Alexander. And then the last segment, I want to get back to the submarines. What do we need to get? Who are the main contenders? Just to give a sense of what's coming up down the line.
So this is probably the part that's most perplexing, is that, so let's go back to the defense policy update, because defense policy update is basically the roadmap to 2% and wherever we're going to pay for it, or where we're going to whenever we're going to hit that mark. So the Canadian government had basically two defense policy updates. It had one about a year ago under Anita Anand, who it wasn't a signed one, but there were most of the options got us past 2%, and it had full costing of personnel. It had full costing of sort of capabilities such as submarines, as far as I know. It basically got us to that mark. It had some potentially, it would have money for defense research and innovation. It was a credible plan, and as reports widely said, it is basically got shot down within cabinet or by the PMO. Not clear, but certainly Anand had this plan, and it just went nowhere. And then she left for the Treasury Board, and then Bill Blair comes in. Fast forward to the next defense policy update, which was released earlier this year, possibly because they realized that they were going to go into this meeting and it was going to get really ugly. And then you saw this really mixed messaging. So one of the interesting things was that a lot of the costing that would have got us to 2% was actually just removed. Stuff like, well, we're not going to put the personnel in here because, well, we can't fully get to the personnel, and a lot of the capabilities like the submarines and whatnot, and artillery systems, we're just going to put those as, we're going to explore those purchases. We're not going to actually put the costing for them, full well knowing that they're probably going to be buying most of these capabilities. So if you start a program staff and you have this sort of level of effort that, let's say on the Canadian Patrol Submarine Project, you're basically going to buy yourself a submarine at a certain point, right? Unless you're just going to fritter away that capability and say, we're done in this area, and that's that. So, and you saw the messaging come out. So immediately when they announced, they said, it had this curious statement of, well, we're going to hit 2% by hitting 1.76% as a first step, and we're hitting the 20% capability or equipment capabilities guideline that NATO has. But they didn't want to say 2%. And then 2 weeks later, you have Bill Blair go down to the United States, say, oh yeah, no, we're going to hit 2%. Right? So all the way through, they have a plan. It's there, and for as best as I can understand, is potentially for political reasons. They don't actually want to say to their voting bloc to say, oh, we're hitting 2%. They've assiduously avoided actually saying the thing that they're basically committing themselves to eventually, right? I know that's a really sort of a different way of coming at it, but that's how I see it, is that if you obligate yourself to, the shipbuilding program, which they already have, and that's already been counted for, but also some of the stuff that's going to be needed for Latvia, like air defense, like mobile artillery systems, like the Canadian submarine program, all this come together basically gets you to 2% or more, right? But they just seem really unwilling to say it, right? But again, and this also pushes it well past 2032 under the current timelines that have been announced and all that. Some of this comes through some of the accounting aspects of D&D, accrual accounting on capital projects, which means that they space out any purchase is spaced out over 20 years instead of, they're just not 1 year purchases. So we're not buying the ships this year. We're actually, the ships will be spread out over the lifetime of the project. Those sort of things play a bit into how the budget's calculated, so it makes it a bit of a hash. There's good reasons why we do it, but it just doesn't make it as clean as you would want it to say. So, I mean, that's some of the challenges that are being put to the fore. It just requires program execution from D&D and the government writ large, and that's the other side, as well as actually getting the money out the door. Because there's a lot of funding that went through the Strong, Secure, and Engage, which is the previous defense, or the sort of foundation of the current defense policy in 2017, that still hasn't been executed on. And that's a lot of that is both program execution, but also a lack of government will to actually push it forward.
No, and I think that's important, the political will component. And the previous announcements were not executed or carried out, which also, raised it out that without any clear notion of how we're going to get there, why 2032, how are we going to get it, why are you not announcing it? And I think that part of it is, of course, the government seems to want to sort of stick to um, uh, the dependency that we are maintaining the financial guardrails. We are spending money here and there on everything, including $50 billion for EV subsidies to the richest companies in the world, and whatever have you for our pet domestic projects. We'll spend all that money, but we will maintain this illusion that there will be financial guardrails by not saying that actually we're going to do this and get to 2%. That will be a lot of money. We're just not going to tell you that that will be a lot of money. And 2032 seems to be far enough out there that we don't have to keep those promises, but close enough to make the allies happy, because at least Belgium said 2039, so we're not saying 2039.
I would also, I do think part of it is the sort of their coalition partner or the supply and confidence partner with the NDP, and how assiduously they avoided saying 2%. It was a key point in all the briefings. But again, when Bill Blair goes to Washington, he can full out say it because that's what he needs to say, and sell that to American audience. I think that difference really illustrated, as best I can understand it, really illustrated the sort of the messaging and who they were interested in getting that view across to, and what message they would receive.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's, I think, also is a problem, and I would, seriously find that insulting, in the sense that, the Canadian public don't know, don't watch, they don't, will get away with not saying what we're going to do, but when our allies and partners who actually know what is going on recognize it, they will. So we will be frank with them, but not with the Canadians, which is very disturbing. Alexander, 2%, 2032, does it make sense? How do we get there? What do we need to spend money on? And then I'll get to Richard about the submarines and the last word to Alexander afterwards.
I cannot do better than what Richard has said as to whether Canada can reach or not reach 2%. I think Canadian politicians have talked themselves into dismissing the very notion of 2%. So I think we have to clarify the importance of 2%. So 2014, when NATO did meet in Wales for a summit, the first summit in the context of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, the Allies made a non-enforceable commitment to spend 2% of their GDP on defense, 20% of which on equipment. And Canada was, of course, a signatory to that agreement. And 10 years later, when that agreement was supposed to be consummated, Canada, of course, falls well short of it. While I think 23 of 32 members do reach that particular target. And indeed, there has been some statistical evidence to the fact that the Wales Commitment, as much as it is non-enforceable, did encourage NATO members to spend more and more on their defense. I think Canadians have talked themselves, or at least Canadian leaders have talked themselves into dismissing 2%, precisely because it's seen as this arbitrary number that does not necessarily map on to a clear military posture that Canada would need. That Canada might be doing other things in foreign and defense policy that are not necessarily tangible or easily measured in monetary value. German decision makers invoke these arguments as well. Of course, these arguments can very well be self-serving because they excuse lack of defense spending, but nevertheless, governments like those in Canada and in Germany have made these sorts of arguments. The fact of the matter is, these countries have made these pledges. They've made these pledges to themselves as well as to their allies. And if Canada commits itself as being a responsible stakeholder in this rules-based international order, of which Canadian decision makers are fond of speaking, I do believe there is such a thing as a rules-based international order, by the way, then it behooves you to actually live up to your stated commitments, regardless as to whether you think that 2% is an arbitrary number or not. 2% is actually much less than what Canada was spending on defense during the Cold War, too. So we have to bear that in mind. And there are plenty of poor countries that would love to spend more on social welfare programs, but for security reasons, feel like they have to spend that money away from those programs and onto defense. And there are countries in the Nordic sphere that are able to spend quite a bit on their social programs, in addition to having serious defense establishments. So this notion that there are these trade-offs is one that I think is oversold.
No, exactly. I'll turn to the submarines, but when I highlight one thing, as you just pointed out, Alexander, the guns versus butter debate is a bit of a red herring, in the sense that during the Cold War we did recognize that we need to have the guns to have the butter, and then particularly in Europe, in Western Europe, but also in North America, we built the current social welfare state while spending significant amounts on defense at the same time. So it is important to keep that in mind. And our friend Ben Tallis keeps highlighting that we can do both. We can chew gum and walk at the same time.
And even if you look at the Canadian experience, the 1980s probably was the heyday of Canadian prosperity. That was when we were spending quite a bit, and we had a very strong economy as a result. Or maybe not as a result, but certainly at the same time.
Absolutely.
So to the extent that there's a trade-off, it's only one that has been manifest very recently, and really I think in the imaginations of certain leaders who are simply uncomfortable with defense in the first place.
Yes, and again, I don't find but coming from the politicians, from the academics and others, I can understand criticism of the second 2% and whatnot, which again, yes, not a great proxy for capabilities, etc. But
actually, it is actually right. Defense inputs predict defense outputs.
So yeah, so in that sense, we can have a debate about how much do you do that? Do you really spend 20% of it capabilities is enough? Do you really have more, etc.? We can do that, but the politicians who commit to it, NATO is a consensus-based organization, and it's not a social club. You don't go along to get along. You are supposed to defend your national interest. If you don't think that is serving your national interest, you fight against it, and you make reasons why not to agree on it. I mean, a great example of that sort of linkage is Hungary and Turkey, when it comes to Sweden and Finland. They thought they had other issues they want to address with, and they did fight for it as a national interest component. But if you do agree on that particular terminology, you cannot go back and say, yeah, we agree, but we're not going to keep to it. It is unserious. It is duplicitous to your audience, both the allies and your public, saying, yeah, we did that because we didn't want to cause a problem, but we're not going to keep to that promise anyway, so don't worry about it. That is not an acceptable way of pursuing and defending the national interest. And if you agree on it, you better develop it. And all other countries are also doing it, so we have to do that.
Richard, a very quick point. I somewhat agree 2% is just a number, more because I care about the capability, right, that we put forward. And the reality is that we're going to have to go well beyond 2% to actually, we've so delayed the modernization of the Canadian Armed Forces that most of the equipment now is about 20 years, if not coming to 30 or 40 years, like cases like the CP-140 Maritime Patrol or multi-mission aircraft, or the CF-18s, right? We can't keep. We need a replacement for these programs, a lot of them very, very rapidly. Otherwise, you're just going to have capability divestment. The system is too old and it's unable to find a modern battlefield, and we need to get rid of it. So to some degree, 2% is a guideline, but it's to Alexander's point, 2% in some ways works because the way that, if you look at the budget in general, we are a deployment heavy organization or military, right? We see constant rotations into Latvia, into Africa, or into the Middle East up until about 5 years ago, right? So that the operational side generally stays around the same. What we've really underspent on was the capital. We did not do the modernization at the time it required. We've built up what we call a bow wave, where it's just like these things are kind of pushing up, like if you imagine like on a ship or like this snowplow, we've really got a huge hump that we've got to go over, and that's going to require a lot more budget to sort of to get past that point. So it's the getting to 2% kind of starts aligning a bit of that budget. We hit the 20% threshold, if not 30% threshold on the equipment side on the budget. So I think that's to the point is that I kind of agree that 2% is just a number, but the reality is that it has to go well beyond that because of just the lack of capability that we bring to the fore.
Which brings me to the last thing I wanna talk in the last 5 minutes, which is the submarines, which is one of the key capabilities, particularly when it is related to the central theme of this podcast, the double trouble, Russia and China, and of course defense of Canada from approaches. So Richard, let me start with you. So what do you make of this rehashed announcement? When can we expect to get those? At least have an idea about when we can have the replacement, what kind of capabilities we'll be looking at, who are in the running. Sort of give the audience a bit of an idea why that submarine replacement is important. Number one, and when can we see some real progress on that, and who is in the running for that? And then I'll get to Alexander to talk a bit on the Indo-Pacific component, perhaps, of it, and the importance of maybe the submarines on that too. And then we wrap it up by that.
So the Canadian Patrol Submarine Project is actually it's a bit of a re-announcement. It was actually probably the largest re-announcement. Now there might be, it wasn't too clear that they may get to actually 12 submarines, which is which may actually be somewhat of an announcement. Up until this point, that they've kind of kept those numbers and also the budgetary amounts sort of under wraps, and which they have. This program is pretty essential for the Royal Canadian Navy. It's probably the second most important one behind what's now called the River class destroyers, or used to be known as the Canadian Surface Combatant. If you think about operations in the Indo-Pacific and in the Arctic, having undersea capabilities, it's just the price of admission, right? If you think about, let's say, China and sort of aggression against Taiwan, Japan, or in the South China Sea. Anything within the first island chain, as it's known, which is within I can't remember, like 200 nautical miles or less, right, is going to be severely hampered to operate unless it's undersea. So you're going to need some level of capability there. In our north, with not full under ice, but sort of peri-ice kind of capabilities, having a submarine is pretty essential just to see what Russian or Chinese sort of capabilities are in an area. So this program for the Navy is pretty essential. It should be about 2 or 3 years ahead of where it is. That's partly because it wasn't put into strong secure and engage. And one of the other big reasons why the defense policy update was announced was that the program had got to a point where it needed basically institutional grounding by defense policy to get sort of monies sort of allocated to it and sort of move ahead. And it was one of its big announcements. In terms of capability, because of the ranges, as we just talked about, peri-ice capability in the north and also in the Indo-Pacific, the transit times are quite long. So you're looking at a very large capability, a submarine of a sufficient size that's able to transit from, let's say, Esquimalt or for Halifax, either to the north or across the Pacific without sort of the need for refueling. And then you're thinking about the other thing is that if you think the Victoria class right now probably has about 10 to 15 years left in it. There's real strictures on its ability to operate anymore. The hull gets more and more brittle as the more dives it takes, and it requires upgrades to sort of keep going and become more and more costly. So the Navy's really looking to have something in operation by 2035. So they can have an orderly transition out of the Victoria class fleet into a realistic capability that can operate in these areas. With those in mind, and also the desire to keep as close to American sort of capabilities, just for interoperability reasons, the access to sort of torpedoes and consumables that all the sort of stuff that keeps a capability going, really probably puts you into two submarines or two classes. One is the Taige, which is class, which is the Japanese submarine. The other one is I believe it's the KDX-3. It's the Korean capability. You want something that is also being produced at this time, just because you have 10 years to procure, acquire, bring to here, train, get all that, set up your in-service support. with those timeframes in mind, that really puts it down to two. Now, the German ThyssenKrupp marine systems will say that they're going to be trying to push for capability. The French are going to, and Sabo as well. But the reality of talking to the sort of people who are around in the industry is that it's probably going to come to two classes of submarines, and then there's the question is how do you run a competition, or the real kind of wild card is whether we're going to do a government to government sort of acquisition where the Canadian government will go to, let's say, if it's one of those two, the Japanese government or the South Korean government, and sort of make a deal, because these submarines are going to have to be built in those countries. They're not going to be built here, which is going to cause real issues with a lot of sort of how we do industrial technical benefits in this country, which is the reciprocal economic arrangement to ensure that we get value for money back in Canada. How this is all going to go down is going to be immensely complex. And again, the clock is ticking. The Victoria class needs to be replaced in a very short amount of time. This will be one of the more remarkable programs in terms of if it's pulled off and how the Canadian government can actually maybe do something quickly. Because if it doesn't, then it's not going to go well for the Navy and the Canadian Armed Forces or the country writ large.
No, I mean that's a super important point, and given the track record with these big projects and the domestic political incentives in terms of treating them as regional job programs and other benefits, there seems to be from my side a significant risk of having a very crucial capability gap when we hit 2035 and we don't have the new ones and the old ones are out, and things are not going to get any easy geopolitically speaking. So that is a significant national security threat if we don't move quickly with with national security in mind rather than electoral or domestic economic benefits considerations.
I will say, though, I think that there is that understanding within all the sort of departments within government that are involved in this area that will actually may allow this to happen in this way. I think in some ways it's more straightforward because you're just buying an off-the-shelf capability with minimal modifications. That's something that's been clearly said by the Navy, by the head of Navy, Topsy. This understanding is there, but I mean, it's going to come to cabinet, and you're going to have the usual suspects say, well, but I have a shipyard in my area. Why can't we build this here? And so that fight's always going to happen. But thus far, we've seen some alacrity in how this is going to go forward. So.
Right, well, fingers crossed on that one that the national security considerations will triumph. The political considerations within the political decision making, especially if the military is very clear on the need. Alexander, we're really getting over time here, but I want to give you the last word, particularly when it comes to submarines, and as Richard pointed out, the two of the sort of leading potential partners for this is Japan and South Korea, and of course the Indo-Pacific is going to be increasingly important. And you have been working on this. We had a recent report on the connections between the transatlantic and Indo-Pacific. How do you see the submarine purchase and in terms of Canadian engagement within Indo-Pacific?
Well, to echo what Richard had said, yeah, I think it does make sense to develop those capabilities, although those capabilities are not easy to procure. They are a heavy lift, after all, in the sense that they're going to be technically demanding, they're going to be expensive, and so forth and so forth. I will say that, yes, it does relate to a broader understanding that the Indo-Pacific is going to be much more important to Canada moving forward than what was the case in the past. We see that a little bit even in the summit declaration, which was much more clear-minded about the sort of support that China and North Korea are giving to Russia in its war against Ukraine. The language was fairly strident, at least with respect to describing China as enabling Russia's war of aggression, enabling being the word used in the summit declaration. Of course, as we all know, Canada is still struggling with basic issues relating to foreign interference, and the price tag there is actually not very significant. The technical demands are very light, as a matter of fact, relative to submarines. And we still seem not to be very serious about tackling that particular problem set. So, and I think this goes back to this earlier point that I was making earlier, that it's not just a matter of getting the hardware, it's also having the software in place. And we just don't have that software. And how we're dealing with the issue of foreign interference, Chinese police stations on our soil, and so forth, really speaks to that particular issue. So, without even thinking ahead to submarines, we have really more fundamental problems that we have to address.
No, I think that's actually an excellent point to end, because I do want to do another episode, particularly focusing on the strategic culture and the what you call the software and the ways of thinking, both within the bureaucracy, within the political class, but also broadly within the public, and its importance as the world is not going to get any more peaceful or easygoing for us in the next decade or two. So that, I think, it will be that hardening that particular software and upgrading it in a way is going to be extremely important. And when we face this this double trouble of Russia and China. Now, thanks for the audience for staying with us. We are a little bit over time, but you have been watching or listening Double Trouble, MLI's podcast, new podcast series, where we look at Russia and China and the challenges those two regimes and countries pose for us and our allies. Double Trouble is generously supported by Konrad-Adenauer's Konrad-Adenauer Foundation's Canada office. So we're grateful for the support, and we're grateful for the audience for sticking with us. And Richard and Alexander, thanks for coming for the show, and looking forward to do more of these.